The leather of his boot connected with the worn-out cardboard box, sending a spray of old photographs and yellowed letters across the damp pavement. A cruel, satisfying crunch. Mark Renshaw smiled. It was a thin, wet thing, a predator's smile that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were small and hard, like chips of slate. He looked down at the woman kneeling on the ground, her hands hovering uselessly over the scattered memories of a life he was gleefully tearing apart. Clara. Her name was as soft and unassuming as she was. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just knelt there, a statue of quiet devastation, which only infuriated him more. He wanted tears. He craved the sound of breaking sobs. It was the currency of his power. "Look at this junk," he sneered, his voice loud in the unnatural silence of the small residential street. "Pathetic, just like you." He nudged a framed picture with his toe. It was a photo of a young girl with Clara's gentle eyes, smiling, holding a puppy. Her daughter, lost years ago to a sickness that had stolen the light from Clara's world. "I'm doing you a favor, you know," Renshaw continued, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "Getting rid of all this clutter. A fresh start." The neighbors watched from behind twitching curtains. They were the chorus, the silent, frightened audience to his matinee of cruelty. Their fear was a warm blanket to him. It affirmed his place in the world. He was the one who acted, and they were the ones who watched, helpless. This was control. This was power. He leaned down, his face close to hers, his breath a foul mix of stale coffee and self-satisfaction. "You had your chance, Clara. I gave you weeks. All you had to do was sign. But you're stubborn. You think your little dignity matters." He laughed, a short barking sound. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the soft flesh. He hauled her to her feet. She was light, like a bird, fragile. "Now, you're going to watch as my men empty every last piece of your pathetic life onto the street, and then the bulldozer comes. You understand me?" Clara looked at him. Her eyes were not filled with the terror he expected. They were filled with a profound, weary sorrow. It wasn't a sorrow for herself. It was for him. This realization was a spark on dry tinder, and his temper flared into a hot, ugly fire. Who was she to pity him? He raised his hand, the motion sharp and vicious. The crowd behind the windows gasped as one. This was it, the final, undeniable act of domination, the slap that would break her. The sound that came next was not the crack of a hand against skin. It was something else entirely. A low, deep hum. It was the sound of expensive engines, purring in perfect, menacing unison. Renshaw paused, his hand still in the air. He turned his head, annoyed by the interruption. Down the narrow street, turning the corner with the slow, deliberate grace of a fleet of sharks, came a procession of vehicles. 1, 2, 3 black SUVs. Their windows were tinted to an impossible monolithic darkness. They absorbed the light. They absorbed the sound. 4, 5, 6, 7. They slid to a stop, forming a perfect, silent semicircle that blocked the entire street, caging him in. The world seemed to hold its breath. The engines cut out, and the silence that descended was heavier, more profound than any noise. It was a weighted silence, thick with unspoken threat. The neighbors were no longer behind their curtains. They were at their windows, their doors. Their fear of Renshaw vaporized and replaced by a new, more primal awe. Renshaw's smirk faltered. This was not part of his script. He was a big fish in a small, dirty pond. These vehicles, they were from the ocean. Deep, dark water. The driver's side door of the lead vehicle opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a simple, perfectly tailored, black suit, no tie. His hair was silver at the temples, cut short. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of immense, contained power. There was nothing wasted in his posture, nothing hesitant in his gaze. His eyes, a pale, piercing gray, scanned the scene. They took in the scattered belongings, the 2 brutish men Renshaw had hired, the fear on the neighbors' faces, Renshaw's hand still raised in the air, and finally, they rested on Clara. For the first time, an emotion flickered across his face. It was not anger. It was something colder, deeper, a quiet, absolute resolve. Renshaw, puffed up with the last dregs of his bravado, took a step forward. "Hey, this is a private matter. Who the hell do you think you are?" The man in black did not look at him. His focus remained entirely on Clara. He spoke. His voice was not loud. It was a low, calm baritone, but it cut through the silence like a judgment, and every single person on that street heard every single syllable. "Clara," he said her name like a promise. "Are you all right?" And in that moment, Mark Renshaw felt the first cold, greasy finger of true fear trace its way down his spine. He was no longer the director of this play. He wasn't even an actor. He was just part of the set, about to be dismantled. To understand the weight of that moment, the tectonic shift that occurred on that shabby street, you need to understand the day before. You need to understand the storm. It had been a monster, a swirling vortex of black clouds and horizontal rain that turned the sky into a bruised, weeping wound. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the old pines that surrounded Clara's small, isolated cabin by the lake. This was her sanctuary, the place she had retreated to after her life had fallen apart, a place of quiet healing far from the noise of the world. She had been a combat medic. She had served 2 tours, her hands steady under the screaming chaos of battle, her mind a fortress of calm procedure. But the enemy she couldn't defeat was the one that came silently, in the night, for her own child. The quiet, insidious sickness had taken Lily, and with her, it had taken Clara's purpose. So she had come here, to the edge of the water, to be alone with her ghosts. That afternoon, the storm had a different voice. It was not just the wind. Beneath its howl, there was a rhythmic, struggling whump, whump, whump. A helicopter, flying dangerously low, fighting the gale. It was a sleek, private machine, a rich man's toy, hopelessly outmatched by the raw fury of nature. Clara watched from her window, a knot of professional concern tightening in her stomach. No one should be flying in this. It was suicide. She saw it happen with the detached clarity of a slow-motion nightmare. A gust of wind, solid as a fist, slammed into the aircraft. It tilted violently. The rotor sputtered, coughed, and then a horrifying silence as the engine died. The helicopter, no longer a machine of flight but a simple, heavy piece of metal, dropped from the sky. It hit the churning, white-capped surface of the lake with a sound like a car crash, a sickening crunch of metal and a violent spray of water. It bobbed for a moment, a wounded beast, and then began to sink. Clara didn't think. She acted. The training, buried under years of grief, surged to the surface. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a medic. There was a mission. She pulled on her heavy rain gear, grabbed the emergency trauma kit she always kept stocked, and sprinted out into the storm. The wind tore at her, trying to push her back. But she leaned into it, her focus absolute. She launched her small aluminum boat into the waves, the outboard motor roaring to life with a reassuring cough. The lake was a maelstrom. Waves crashed over the bow, soaking her, chilling her to the bone. But her eyes were locked on the spot where the helicopter had gone down. An oil slick was spreading, a dark stain on the gray water. Bubbles. She reached the wreckage just as the last of the cabin slipped beneath the surface. The pilot was clearly gone, his side of the cockpit crushed inward. But on the passenger side, she saw a hand, pressed against the inside of the thick plexiglass. Someone was alive. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the rain-soaked air, and dove. The cold was a shock, a physical blow that stole her breath, but adrenaline was a fire in her veins. She swam down, pulling herself along the sinking fuselage. The passenger door was jammed. Inside, a man was suspended in the murky, green water, his seatbelt the only thing holding him in place. His face was a mess of blood, but his eyes were open, conscious, though fading fast. She saw the look in them. Not panic. Resignation. He had accepted his death. Clara did not accept it. She surfaced, gasped for air, and dove again, this time with the small crowbar from her boat's emergency kit. She wedged it into the seam of the door and pulled with every ounce of strength she possessed. The metal groaned, resisted, and then, with a screech, it gave way. The water inside surged out, and she had to fight the current to get to him. His seatbelt buckle was jammed. She pulled out the tactical knife she always carried, a relic from her old life, and sawed through the thick webbing. He was a dead weight, a big man, all lean muscle and dense bone. Getting him out of the sinking wreck was the hardest physical thing she had ever done. Her lungs were burning, her vision starting to tunnel, blackness creeping in at the edges. But she kicked, pulled, and fought her way back to the surface, dragging him with her. She broke through into the screaming wind, gasping, coughing up water. She hauled him over the side of her small boat, his unconscious body landing with a heavy thud on the aluminum floor. He was not breathing. "Don't you dare," she grunted, her voice raw. "Not after all that." She started CPR. Chest compressions, rhythmic and brutal, on the deck of a tiny boat being tossed around by a hurricane. 1, 2, 3, 4. She was counting, focusing, channeling all her training into this one singular task. She tilted his head back, pinched his nose, and breathed her own life into his lungs. Once, twice. He coughed, a violent, racking spasm that brought up a lungful of lake water and blood. His eyes fluttered open. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and startlingly intense. He looked at her, a flicker of confusion, of disbelief. Then he passed out. Getting him back to her cabin was another battle against the elements. She dragged him from the boat, up the muddy bank, and into the warmth of her small home. She cut away his soaked, expensive clothes. His body was a roadmap of old scars, a testament to a life of violence. A faded, intricate tattoo of a coiled serpent covered his back. He had multiple lacerations, a dislocated shoulder, and what she suspected were at least 2 broken ribs. And he was slipping into shock, his skin cold and clammy. For the next 12 hours, she worked. She was no longer in a cabin. She was in a field hospital. She cleaned and stitched his wounds with the steady hands of a surgeon. She popped his shoulder back into place, earning a sharp grunt of pain from his unconscious form. She wrapped his ribs, started a saline drip from her advanced medical kit, and covered him with every blanket she owned. She sat by his side all night, monitoring his breathing, checking his pulse, as the storm finally exhausted itself and raged away into the distance. He was Julian Thorne, though she did not know it at the time. To her, he was just a life she had refused to let go of. He was also, until very recently, the head of the most powerful and feared criminal syndicate on the coast. They called him the Ghost because he was rarely seen, his influence felt but his presence an enigma. He had ruled not through fear alone, but through a rigid, unshakable code of loyalty. He protected his own. He was ruthless to his enemies, but he was fiercely, unshakably just to those under his banner. He had built an empire of shadows, a kingdom that operated by its own laws. But a year ago, that kingdom had cost him everything. A rival faction, breaking a long-held truce, had set a trap. It wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed at his heart. His son, a young man of 20 poised to leave the life behind for a future as an architect, was caught in the crossfire. Julian had retaliated. His vengeance was not a fiery, passionate thing. It was cold, methodical, and absolute. He dismantled the rival organization piece by piece, not with bullets, but with information, with leverage, with ruin. He left them with nothing, but it brought him no satisfaction. His son was still gone. The empire felt hollow. The power tasted like ash. So he had done the unthinkable. He had vanished. He handed control of his organization to his most trusted lieutenant, a man named Marcus, with a single, final directive: to turn their assets legitimate, to build something that lasted, something that created instead of destroyed. He, Julian Thorne, was retiring. He was going to live a quiet life, a ghost in truth. The helicopter flight had been his final journey away from that old life, a trip to a secluded mountain estate where he planned to live out his days in solitude. Nature, it seemed, had other plans. He woke up 2 days later. The cabin was quiet, filled with the soft morning light. The scent of coffee and wood smoke hung in the air. He was in a simple bed. His wounds were professionally dressed. An IV bag hung from a makeshift stand, a coat rack. He turned his head slowly. She was sitting in a chair by the window, reading a book. She looked tired. There were dark circles under her eyes. But she possessed a stillness, a profound sense of peace that he had not encountered in his entire life. It was like finding a spring of clear water in the middle of a desert. She looked up, sensing his gaze. Her eyes were warm, a soft brown, filled with a deep, ancient sadness but no trace of fear. "Good morning," she said, her voice gentle. "I was wondering when you'd wake up." He tried to speak, but his throat was raw. He coughed. She was at his side in an instant, holding a glass of water to his lips. "Easy," she said. "You've been through a lot." He drank, the cool water a balm. He looked around the cabin. It was simple, clean, filled with books and plants. A home, not a house. "You saved me," he finally managed to rasp. She nodded simply. "You were sinking. I couldn't just watch." "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is Clara," she replied. "And you're in my home. You're safe here." He stayed for a week. He was a model patient, never complaining, his body healing with a disciplined speed that amazed her. They spoke. Very little, but a comfortable silence grew between them. He watched her as she went about her day, tending her garden, reading her books. He saw the strength beneath her gentle exterior, the resilience in her quiet dignity. He saw the faded photograph of the little girl on her mantelpiece and understood the source of the sadness in her eyes. He recognized a fellow survivor, someone who had lost a world and was trying to build a new one from the wreckage. One morning he was gone. He had left a simple note on the table, written in a strong, clear hand. "I can never repay you, but I will try. You gave me back my life, Clara. If you ever need anything at all, you will be heard." Beneath the words was a phone number. Nothing else. Clara had folded the note and put it away. It was a kind gesture from a stranger she had helped. She never expected to use it. She had her own problems to deal with. She had moved from the cabin back to the small house in the city, the house her parents had left her, the house where she had raised Lily. She needed to be among people again, even if she kept them at a distance. But the neighborhood was changing. Developers were circling, hungry for land. A man named Mark Renshaw had bought up most of the properties on her block. He used intimidation and legal loopholes to force the old residents out. He saw her as the final, stubborn obstacle. A weak woman, alone, an easy target. He started with lowball offers. She politely refused. The house was all she had left of her family. Then came the veiled threats, the notices of fake code violations, the late-night phone calls with no one on the other end. Her tires were slashed, garbage was dumped on her lawn. Clara endured it all with a quiet, unyielding patience. She was a soldier. She knew how to hold a line. Her refusal to break, to even show fear, infuriated Renshaw. It was a personal insult to his power. He needed to make an example of her. That morning, he had arrived with 2 hired thugs and a deed of eviction he had obtained through a corrupt judge. It was fraudulent, but it was a piece of paper, and he believed in the power of paper and brute force. He had ordered his men to start throwing her things onto the street. He wanted to humiliate her publicly. He wanted to strip her of her home, her memories, her dignity, all in front of the neighbors he had terrorized into submission. It had escalated, his rage feeding on her calm, until he had raised his hand to strike her. And the 7 black SUVs had arrived. The silence on the street was now absolute. It was a living thing, a presence. Julian Thorne took a slow, deliberate step toward Clara. He ignored Renshaw completely, as if he were a piece of furniture, an irrelevant detail in the background. His gray eyes were locked on her face. "He hurt you," Julian stated. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. He saw the red marks on her arm where Renshaw's fingers had dug in. Clara finally found her voice, a small, wavering thing. "Julian, what are you doing here?" "You were not answering your phone," he said simply, as if that explained the arrival of a paramilitary force on her quiet suburban street. "I was concerned." He had, in fact, given her a new phone after he left her cabin, a simple burner with only one number programmed into it. His. He had instructed his people to monitor it. Not the calls, but the phone's status. For the last 3 hours, it had been powered off. Clara's battery had died, a simple, mundane occurrence. To Julian, whose world was built on paranoia and preparedness, a silent phone was a red flag, an anomaly, a potential threat, so he had come to see for himself. Renshaw finally found his voice, a spluttering, indignant squawk. "I don't know who you are, pal, but this is my property. This woman is a squatter, and I'm having her removed. I have the paperwork." He waved the fraudulent eviction notice like a talisman, expecting it to ward off this new, terrifying presence. Julian stopped. He turned his head slowly, and for the first time, he acknowledged Renshaw's existence. He didn't look at Renshaw's face. He looked at the paper in his hand. Then his eyes drifted to the scattered photographs on the pavement, then to the red marks on Clara's arm. His gaze finally rose to meet Renshaw's. There was no heat in Julian's eyes, no anger. There was something far, far worse, a chilling, absolute emptiness. It was the calm of a frozen lake, miles deep. It was the look of a man who had made decisions that could end lives, topple governments, and erase fortunes, and had then gone home to eat a quiet dinner. Renshaw felt his blood turn to ice water. The bravado, the anger, the petty tyranny that had fueled him his entire life, it all shriveled and died under that gaze. He was suddenly, acutely aware of his own mortality. He was a yapping dog that had just tried to bite a wolf. "You have paperwork," Julian said, his voice a soft murmur that was somehow more menacing than a shout. From the other SUVs, doors opened in perfect sync. 6 men, all dressed in dark, functional attire, stepped out. They were not thugs. They were professionals. They moved with the same disciplined quiet as their leader, their eyes scanning, assessing, missing nothing. They fanned out, securing the street with an unspoken, practiced efficiency. One of them, a sharp-faced man with a scar above his eyebrow, approached Julian. It was Marcus, his second in command, the man now running the legitimate empire. Marcus held out a tablet. He didn't say a word. Julian took it. He looked down at the screen, his expression unchanging. "Mark Renshaw," Julian said, reading from the tablet, though he wasn't really reading. He was reciting. "Owner of Renshaw Properties, LLC, a shell corporation registered offshore. You have acquired 37 properties in this district over the last 2 years, 36 of them through coercive means." Renshaw's face went pale. "How? How do you know that? You have 2 active lawsuits against you for tenant harassment, both tied up in court by a Judge Thompson, who happens to be your brother-in-law," Julian continued, his voice still a calm, level monotone. "You have a gambling debt of $247,000 owed to the Chen Syndicate. They are displeased with your lack of payment." The blood drained completely from Renshaw's face. He looked like a ghost. The Chen Syndicate was not known for its patience. "You have an offshore account with $1.2 million, skimmed from your business partners. Your partners, I believe, are under the impression that the company is barely breaking even." Julian looked up from the tablet, his eyes locking onto Renshaw's. "And 3 years ago, an elderly tenant in one of your buildings died in a fire caused by faulty wiring you had been repeatedly warned about. The investigation was closed, deemed an accident. The investigator, also a close personal friend of Judge Thompson." The air crackled. The neighbors, the chorus, were listening, their fear of Renshaw transforming into a cold, righteous anger. They had all known, they had all suspected, but they had been too afraid to speak. Now, this stranger was speaking for them, laying the sordid truth bare in the middle of the street. Renshaw began to tremble. This wasn't just a rich guy in a fancy car. This was something else. Someone who could peel back the layers of a man's life in a matter of minutes and see every rotten secret underneath. Who are you?" Renshaw whispered, his voice cracking. Julian handed the tablet back to Marcus. He took a step closer to Renshaw, invading his personal space. Renshaw flinched back, stumbling over one of his own boxes of stolen memories. "My name is not important," Julian said softly. "What is? Important is that you made a mistake. You see, you believe power comes from a piece of paper, from a loud voice, from hurting people who cannot fight back." He gestured to the scattered belongings. You believe this is strength." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "You are wrong." Julian turned his back on Renshaw, a gesture of such profound dismissal that it was more insulting than any blow. He walked back to Clara. He stood before her, his imposing frame, a shield between her and the mess Renshaw had made of her life. "Clara," he said, his voice softening, all the ice melting away, leaving only a quiet warmth. "This man and his associates will be leaving now. They will not trouble you again. I give you my word." He then did something that shocked everyone on the street. He knelt, not in a dramatic, theatrical way, but slowly, carefully. He knelt down on the damp pavement, ignoring his expensive suit. He began to pick up the scattered photographs, his large, scarred hands surprisingly gentle. He treated each one as if it were a precious artifact. He picked up the framed picture of Lily. He looked at the smiling girl's face for a long moment, and a flicker of his own ancient pain crossed his features. He understood loss. He understood what this picture meant. He held it out to Clara. "This belongs to you," he said. Tears finally welled in Clara's eyes. Not tears of fear or humiliation, tears of gratitude. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. A stranger had shown her more kindness in these few moments than she had seen in years. She took the picture, her fingers brushing his. Julian looked up at her from his kneeling position. "He has caused you pain. He has caused this whole neighborhood pain. Justice should be served, but I will not act without your consent. This is your home, your life. He did this to you." He rose to his feet, turning to face the now catatonic Renshaw. "So I ask you, Clara, what do you want to happen to him?" The street was utterly silent. Every eye was on Clara. The neighbors, Marcus and his men, even the two hired thugs who were now trying to make themselves invisible. The power had shifted. It had been transferred, in its entirety, from the loud, cruel bully to the quiet, gentle woman he had tried to break. This was her moment, her choice. Renshaw stared at her, his eyes wide with pleading terror. His life was in her hands. He expected her to demand vengeance. He would have. He would have asked for blood, for pain, for ruin. He judged her by his own broken standards. Clara looked at Renshaw. She saw a small, pathetic man, inflated by a false sense of power, now deflated and terrified. She didn't feel hatred. She didn't feel anger. She felt only a deep, profound pity. He was a hollow man, and all the money and property in the world couldn't fill the emptiness inside him. She remembered her time as a medic. She had treated wounded, soldiers from both sides of a conflict. In the end, when they were bleeding on the ground, they were all just scared men, far from home. Her job was not to judge, it was to heal. She looked at Julian, her voice clear and steady, no longer wavering. It was the voice of a woman who knew her own mind, her own strength. "I don't want him hurt," she said, a flicker of surprise in Julian's eyes. He had been prepared to unleash a cold and terrible ruin upon this man. He had a dozen plans already in motion, legal and otherwise, that would have erased Mark Renshaw from existence. He built his life by making people feel small, Clara continued, her gaze fixed on Renshaw. By taking their homes, their security, their dignity. He doesn't understand what that feels like. He thinks it's a game. She took a deep breath. "I don't want revenge. I want him to understand." She looked directly at Renshaw, her eyes locking with his. "I want him to live the life of the quoting understand, people he has displaced. I want him to know what it's like to have nothing, to be dependent on the kindness of strangers, to have to rebuild a life from scratch, with no one to help him but himself." She turned back to Julian. "Can you do that? Not as a punishment, as a lesson." Julian Thorne stared at Clara for a long moment. He had expected a cry for vengeance. He had been offered a blank check for retribution, and she had chosen empathy. Forced empathy, perhaps, but empathy nonetheless. It was a form of justice he had never considered. It was more profound, more elegant, and in its own way, more devastating than anything he could have devised. It wasn't about destroying the man. It was about destroying the monster inside the man. A slow, small smile touched Julian's lips. It was a rare sight, and it transformed his harsh features, making him look almost peaceful. "Yes, Clara," he said, his voice filled with a deep, quiet respect. "I can do that." He turned to Marcus. "Marcus, you heard the lady. Our plans have changed." Marcus nodded, a look of admiration on his face. He had served Julian for 20 years. He had seen him orchestrate corporate takeovers and dismantle rival gangs with the same cold precision. But he had never seen this. "The assets," Julian said, his voice returning to its commanding calm. "All of Renshaw's properties. Seize them. Legally. Use the leverage we have. The gambling debts, the offshore accounts, the evidence from the fire. His partners will be cooperative. His brother-in-law, the judge, will recuse himself. Permanently." Marcus was already typing into his tablet, his fingers flying across the screen. "Once we have control," Julian continued, "we form a trust. The properties will be converted into low-income housing, renovated, brought up to code. The rents will be fair. The trust will be managed by a board." He looked at Clara. "And you, Clara, will be the head of that board. If you'll accept, you will be in charge of ensuring that no one is ever treated this way again." Clara was stunned into silence. She had asked for a lesson, and he was offering her a legacy. A way to turn this ugly, hateful act into something that could help hundreds of people. "As for Mr. Renshaw," Julian said, turning his cold gaze back on the trembling man, "his bank accounts will be frozen, his assets liquidated to pay his debts and to fund the renovations. He will be left with one set of clothes and $100 in cash." He paused. "And he has a new job. He will be working at the downtown homeless shelter, the one he tried to have shut down last year. He'll be cleaning floors, serving food. He will live in the shelter, among the people his actions have created. He will hear their stories. He will learn their names. He will work there for 1 year. At the end of that year, if he has learned his lesson, he will be free to go. With nothing." It was a sentence of total annihilation, delivered without a single raised voice. It was not death. It was a forced rebirth, a baptism by fire in the world of the powerless. 2 of Marcus's men stepped forward. They moved with a silent, fluid grace. They did not grab Renshaw. They simply stood on either side of him. Their presence was enough. "Take him," Julian said softly, "and give his 2 employees a ride to the edge of town. Advise them to never return." The 2 thugs Renshaw had hired, who had been trying to blend in with the scenery, suddenly found themselves flanked by 2 more of Julian's men. They went pale and complied without a word, their bravado gone, replaced by the primal fear of men who knew they were hopelessly outmatched. Renshaw was escorted away, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. He was a king one moment, a pauper the next. His kingdom, built on fear and paper, had been dismantled by a quiet conversation on a sidewalk. As he was led to one of the SUVs, an old man stepped out from one of the neighboring houses. It was Mr. Henderson, a retired history teacher who had lived on the street for 50 years. He was the wise elder, the one who remembered everything. He walked right up to Julian Thorne, his back straight, his eyes clear. Julian's men tensed, but Julian held up a hand, stopping them. Mr. Henderson looked at Julian, then at Clara. "For years," the old man said, his voice raspy but strong, "we have lived in fear of that small man. We watched him bully and cheat our friends. We did nothing because we were afraid. We were alone." He looked at the other neighbors, who were now emerging from their homes, drawn by the quiet drama. "Today," Mr. Henderson continued, "you reminded us of something we had forgotten. That true strength isn't loud. It doesn't need to threaten. True strength is quiet. It protects. It defends." He looked at Clara, and his eyes softened. "And you, my dear girl, you reminded us that kindness is not weakness. It is the greatest strength of all. To be given the chance for vengeance and to choose compassion instead. That is true power." He nodded at Julian, a gesture of profound respect from one old soldier to another. "Thank you, sir. You have given us back our neighborhood." Julian simply inclined his head in return. The SUVs departed as silently as they had arrived. taking with them the last vestiges of Mark Renshaw's toxic reign. The street felt lighter. The air itself seemed cleaner. Julian turned to Clara. His men were already silently, efficiently gathering her scattered belongings, packing them carefully back into the boxes. "I apologize for the intrusion," Julian said. "It was not my intention to bring this chaos to your door." Clara shook her head, a small, watery smile on her face. "You didn't bring the chaos, Julian. You ended it." She looked at the house, then at the neighbors who were now approaching, their faces filled with relief and gratitude. For the first time in years, she felt like she was part of a community. She felt a home. "The trust," she began. "The housing. I don't know anything about that." "You will learn," Julian said with quiet confidence. "You know what is right and what is wrong. That is all the expertise you need. Marcus will handle the details. He will be at your disposal." A new life was opening up in front of her, one she had never imagined. A purpose, a mission. Not one of healing bodies on a battlefield, but of healing a community, of building something safe and good out of the rubble of something cruel. "Why?" she asked him, the question that had been hovering in the air since he arrived. "Why do all this for me?" Julian looked away, his gaze falling on the distant lake, visible between the houses. He was remembering the cold, the darkness, the feeling of his lungs filling with water, the feeling of resignation, and then the fierce, stubborn refusal of the woman who would not let him die. "In my former life," he said, his voice low, "I took a great many things. I balanced ledgers of violence and profit. I built an empire on fear and loyalty. But it was a hollow thing. It cost me my son." He met her eyes again, and she saw the raw, unhealed wound of his grief. "You, Clara, you build things. You heal. You saved my life, and you asked for nothing in return. You showed me a different kind of strength. The world has enough destroyers. It needs more builders." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, old-fashioned key. "Your home will need renovations," he said, "to repair the damage Renshaw's neglect has caused. My men will see to it. In the meantime, I have a place. It's quiet, by a lake. You might find it peaceful." It was the key to his mountain estate, the one he had been flying to when he crashed. "I owe you a debt," Julian said. "A life for a life. Allowing me to help you, it helps me balance my own ledger. It is, perhaps, the first truly good thing I have done in a very long time." 3 months later, the street was transformed. The houses, once shabby and neglected, were being repaired. Fresh coats of paint, new roofs, gardens being tended. The work was being done by a construction company owned by Julian's new, legitimate corporation. Local workers were hired, paid a fair wage. Clara's house was the centerpiece, restored to its former beauty. But she wasn't there often. She was usually at her new office, a small, bright space in one of the newly acquired buildings. As the head of the Oak Street Housing Trust, she was busy. She reviewed applications, met with tenants, coordinated repairs, and listened to the stories of the people she was now responsible for. She was no longer the quiet, solitary woman who hid from the world. She was a leader, a protector in her own right. The sadness was still in her eyes. It would always be there, a part of her. But now it was joined by a fierce, bright light of purpose. She was honoring Lily's memory by building a world with more kindness in it. Julian visited her sometimes. He would arrive in a single, modest car, no entourage. He would sit in her office and listen as she talked about her work. He never offered advice unless asked. He was simply present. A quiet, steadying force. A friend. One afternoon, she received a letter. It had no return address. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. It was from Mark Renshaw. He had been at the shelter for 3 months. He wrote that the first month was hell. He was arrogant, angry, resentful. He hated the work. He hated the people. He was still the king in his own mind, just temporarily inconvenienced. But then, he wrote, he started to listen. He listened to the story of an old woman who had lost her apartment because her new landlord, a man named Renshaw, had doubled the rent. He served food to a young family with a sick child who had been evicted from a building with faulty wiring. He cleaned the bathroom floor alongside a man who had lost his job and his home after a workplace injury at a construction site owned by a shell corporation he didn't know was connected to him. He was, for the first time in his life, face to face with the consequences of his own casual cruelty. They weren't numbers on a spreadsheet. They were people, with names, with stories, with pain that he had personally caused. "I see their faces in my sleep," he wrote. "I never saw them before. I never saw anyone. I only saw obstacles, numbers, profits. I don't know if I can ever be forgiven," the letter concluded. "I don't think I deserve to be, but I wanted you to know. Thank you. It sounds insane, but thank you. You didn't destroy me. You made me see." Clara folded the letter. She did not know if Renshaw's change was real or permanent, but it was a start. Her choice, the path of compassion, had not been a weakness. It had been a seed, and in the most barren of soil, it had begun to grow. That evening, Julian was with her on the porch of her renovated house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with the gentle sounds of families settling in for the evening. It was a peaceful sound, a sound of safety. "You were right," Julian said, breaking the comfortable silence. "About what?" Clara asked. "About the nature of justice," he said. "My way. It cuts out the disease, but it leaves a scar. Your way. It offers the chance for a cure." He looked out at the street, at the homes he had helped save, all at her direction. "This is a better empire," he said quietly, "than any I have ever built." Clara smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes. "It's not an empire, Julian, it's a neighborhood." He nodded, accepting the correction. He had been a ghost for so long, a king of shadows. But here, in the gentle twilight, sitting beside this impossibly strong woman, he felt something he had not felt since he was a young man, long before the violence and the power. He felt something like hope. The world was still a dangerous place. There would always be bullies like Mark Renshaw, men who mistook cruelty for strength. But there would also be people like Clara, quiet, gentle souls with spines of steel, who knew that true power was not in the clenched fist, but in the open hand. Not in the act of breaking, but in the patient, stubborn, and beautiful art of healing. And as long as they existed, there was a chance for the light to win.